Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our weekly webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. It's January 26th, 2019, and we're having a reemergence, or not even so much a reemergence, but a reassertion of the neocon faction in Washington, now with the sights set on a regime change coup in Venezuela. Some of the same people who have been involved back with the Bush family, going back to Iran-Contra and other operations. Helga, what's the significance of this in terms of the global strategic situation?
Well, I think that given the fact that due to both the Russian intervention in Syria and also President Trump's decision to pull out the troops from Syria, that crisis spot somehow has been diffused. So I think, since the real aim of the war party is to cause a confrontation with Russia and China, I think they shifted to the situation in Venezuela. And, from the standpoint of international law, it's completely illegal what people like Pompeo and others are demanding. Pompeo went to the Organization of Latin American States, demanding that they all should support Guaido. I don't know if I pronounce his name in the right way, but it's not a question of liking or not liking President Maduro. I mean, he is the president of Venezuela, and this is just a classical regime change operation, which obviously was completely refused by Russia, by China, by India, by President Obrador from Mexico, by Uruguay. Even the Brazilian military flatly refused that any Brazilian troops would be involved. This is now a highly dangerous situation. It could lead to a civil war, which is why all reasonable parties call for dialogue and not any other action. And naturally, it does have the potential to lead to a confrontation with Russia and China. It's really a very, but what it does to international law is really, I think, the biggest problem. So, just to give you a sense of it, somebody came up with the idea that, by the same token, when you demand that, this head of the parliament, Guaido, should be recognized, by the same token, President Maduro could say the yellow vests in France are the legitimate government of France and not Macron. If you start doing these kinds of things, then obviously haywire starts to develop in the international community. And I think this is really a very, very dangerous development. I mean, it's also pretty transparent. Even the economic commentator in the official first channel of the German TV said this has nothing to do with democracy or human rights. It's all about oil. Now, that may be a little bit short-sighted because it's a larger geopolitical confrontation between the old and the new paradigm, but oil for sure is also a factor in the situation. So I think this will all, unfortunately accelerate the process of discreditation of the present neoliberal order, because the methods with which they operate becomes more clear to everybody in every corner of the world.
And as you mentioned, geopolitics as being a major feature of this, it's not surprising that the usual suspects, Britain and France, came out and endorsed the regime change. I don't know whether other countries have been heard from yet, but as you mentioned, Uruguay, Mexico are very much opposed to this. And I think it's important to note that it's the old Bush crowd that's coming forward now, taking over the policy, at least in this case, of the Trump administration. Now, we also saw, speaking of the neocons, this, what is the Defense Strategy Review or National Strategy Review that just came out, which is quite a chilling kind of document, but it goes in the direction we've seen. what was the reaction from the Russians and the Chinese to the being named again as dangerous adversaries?
Well, there was a reaction to the missile defense review, which was, the idea to militarize space, and this was denounced very clearly by the Russian Foreign Ministry, basically saying that this once again shows that instead of going for dialogue, that there is behind it very clearly the aim to dominate space. And they falsely make a reference to the SDI of Reagan. This was, as we discussed many times in this program, a much more complicated issue involving a grand design, how to really overcome this mutual assured destruction by a superior conception, namely mutual assured survival. But in any case, I think that the tensions in the international strategic situation obviously remain extremely high, and the situation is therefore extremely dangerous.
And on these tensions, we had the appearance of the almost 90-year-old George Soros in Davos, who sent out, I think you could say, marching orders about confronting China, Russia, getting rid of Trump. What do you make of Soros's appearance there?
Well, I think that most people would agree with me that he is the ugly face of neoliberal capitalism, if you ever have seen one. But what he is saying there is quite interesting, because he puts together President Xi Jinping and Trump. What he says is that given the fact that China is not only an autocratic government, but they are wealthy, they are powerful economically, and they have developed artificial intelligence to a degree where basically they could impose, their system. And he says Xi Jinping, therefore, is the biggest threat to his conception of an open society, which is this, this idea of everything goes, the liberal values of the West. Now, obviously, this is quite incredible, because the Chinese reaction to this was to say it's not worth commenting on it, because if somebody so obviously turns black into white and white into black, it doesn't deserve a rebuttal. I think the Russian reaction to the speech was also very interesting. I think it was the Minister for Economic Development, Oreshkin, who basically said, well, the United States has nobody to blame but themselves. If you look what this open society conception did to the United States in the last 30 years, falling income, tripling of healthcare cost, general cultural decay, then that is the result. So they should really look at that. And I think this is really the problem, because this whole conception of open society is a synonym for everything which has gone wrong with what Lavrov calls the post-Christian values of the Western system, what some people defend as, the Western values and so forth. But if you look at these Western values, you see actually moral rot and decay. And Soros, I think, made himself quite a picture there in Davos. And I think he is really the synonym for everything which is wrong with the West.
It's also the case that Soros has been an operative of this British imperial system, because the other point you made is, besides the ugly face, is that this is the British imperial system that's disguised with this philosophical cover of being open society.
Yes, I think that's quite true.
Well, on this question then of the British, there have been a continued series of exposés that have come out. Of course, we had something which occurred just yesterday, which is the incredible arrest of Roger Stone, who was accused by Mueller of lying to Congress. And yet his arrest was with a huge corps of FBI agents, with a cameraman there to film it, early in the morning. this is an overkill. I mean, do you think people can begin to see the desperation that's involved from Mueller's side with the way Roger Stone was treated?
Well, I think the quite renowned, I think he's a constitutional lawyer, Dershowitz, put out a statement which I think is very much to the point, by saying that the entire aim of that is as it was done in the case of Manafort and Michael Cohen, to threaten close associates or former close associates of Trump with so much trouble, like threatening long jail times, ruining them through bankruptcy because of legal fees. So basically, in an effort to turn them against Trump. Now, Roger Stone has declared that he will absolutely not lie against Trump. And I think he is a man of honor and will not do that for sure. But I think it is also very clear that this is supposed to be creating an environment of complete McCarthyism and terror, which is really absolutely incredible. Now, I think the Russians, for their part, sometimes prove really good humors. For example, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said in the context of the coup attempts in Venezuela, that in Venezuela you don't need Robert Mueller, a special investigator, to see that there is foreign meddling in the situation. So I think that is indeed very true. And I think Roger Stone is absolutely right when he, when he said that he is not guilty and he's now free on bail, and we should see how this falls. Dershowitz, by the way, also said that all the crimes which Mueller named, supposedly committed by Roger Stone, were not related to Trump in the 2016 campaign, but also so-called process crimes, which, in other words, things which happened then after Mueller started the investigation. So it's all an absolute orchestration, and people should really understand that this must stop.
I think Dershowitz made an additional point, which is that in the context of these being process crimes, that is, they had nothing to do with the Russiagate story, the narrative of Russian meddling and cooperation from the Trump campaign. Instead, they all have to do with people reacting to be put under pressure by Mueller. And that Dershowitz said, perhaps the way Mueller is approaching things and the way prosecutors approach things is witness tampering, by threatening people with bankruptcy, as in the case of Roger Stone, with millions of dollars of legal fees. Manafort, the same thing. When they are no longer able to fight, then they end up submitting, or that's the prosecutorial theory. So this has to be stopped in the United States. I was at a meeting last night, and people who had seen this said this reminded them of the period of the Stasi in East Germany or the Nazis, this kind of dawn raid where someone's dragged out of his bed and charged with completely frivolous charges. Now, I want to come back in a few minutes to this a little bit more on the secret government operations, but the other area of desperation that we should just take up is what's happening with the financial system. There are new reports coming out on derivatives, on inequality. Helga, what have you been looking at in terms of the ongoing financial crisis?
Well, I think the powder keg is, explosive. Basically, the Bank of England just put out a report saying that the outstanding derivatives are not 1.3 trillion, but 2.2 trillion, double, and that this is exactly the amount which existed during the time of the US subprime crisis in 2007, which obviously was the trigger point for the big crisis 2007, 2008. The only difference is that all the instruments of the central banks have been used up. And there's another report now that the Federal Reserve absolutely cannot continue with their incremental interest rate increase because, obviously the situation would blow at any moment. and that they also will keep the total amount of quantitative easing money of about 4 trillion because they cannot afford to continue to tighten up, even if it's only very marginally. So I think we are sitting absolutely on a time bomb. And, if you compare that, the effort to keep an absolutely bankrupt system, and you compare that, for example, with the steady development of the Belt and Road Initiative, where we have said this repeatedly, but I can only continue. It is increasing. It is developing. For example, the Czech Republic President Zeman is just welcoming the Belt and Road Initiative, hoping that Czechia will be a bridge to Western Europe for the Belt and Road Initiative. The much slandered port in Sri Lanka, which everybody was saying, oh, this proves the Sri Lanka is now in the Chinese debt trap. The Sri Lankan officials just said, this is beautiful, this is the best port. This will mean that Sri Lanka will be a hub for the whole South Asia development. Then you have, very good continuous developments with France, where Wang Yi, the foreign minister, is presently. They celebrate, for example, the exchange of Chinese and French students in the 20s, among them Xu Enlai and Deng Xiaoping. And there are deep cultural ties between these traditions. Then Wang Yi is going to Rome, where he will participate in an Italy-China government commission. Geraci, one of the members of the cabinet, was just again praising the collaboration of China and Italy, especially in the development of African projects, saying we have to be concerned not about the 1,000 refugees coming now, but we have to be concerned about the 20 million young Africans who would come if we don't develop the African continent now together, praising a memorandum of understanding between Italy and China. He also calls for Chinese investment in the United States in overcoming the trade deficit by both, China buying commercial airplanes from the United States, but more importantly, having Chinese large-scale capital investments in infrastructure development in the United States. So there are all these constructive approaches, where you can see that if people decide on the new paradigm of economic cooperation, of win-win projects, things are going in the right direction. And, the Chinese also just put out in Davos, actually, a statement that, all this talk about that China is slowing down the world economy because they have only 6.6% growth this past year is completely false, that China is on a path of steady growth. And it is the Western neoliberal, the Soros model, if you want so to say, that is what is the problem, and not the Belt and Road Initiative. And you have these two paradigms who are in complete contrast, where, I can only again say the Schiller Institute is absolutely committed to, make clear and increase the knowledge in the West about what the Chinese model really is, because it is absolutely the opposite of what Soros said in Davos. And, just on that point, to come back to it, the idea that China uses artificial intelligence to control its population is also sort of ludicrous, given the fact that in the United States, for example, apart from the NSA and CHQ in Great Britain, mass surveying everybody, everybody in the West, especially in the United States, but also in Europe, are using the same kind of artificial intelligence, for example, in the justice system, predicting, when people will commit the next crime, something which is absolutely racially biased because they come on the basis of the same kind of algorithm method to the idea that there will be more minority crime than white people crime. They have the same kind of surveillance about creditworthiness, about other such things. So it's really a complete hypocrisy. The question is, to what end are you using these things? And that again comes to the question of what is the image of man underlying in this. And I think the West at this point is not looking so good by comparison.
On this latter point, just to emphasize this even more, you have China reducing the number of people who are poor by 800 million in the last 2 decades, and continuing to drive to the point where there will be no one under the poverty line. And you mentioned earlier this Oxfam report. I think that's a pretty striking contrast, where you have multi-billionaires who have so much wealth. Did you take a look at this Oxfam report, Helga?
Yes. Well, last year, I think it was something like 70 billionaires, multi-billionaires in the world owning as much as half of the human population, because the billionaires are earning every day 2.5 billion more, while half of the rest of the population is losing 500 million per day. It is now 26 individuals who own as much as half of the world population. Now, I think this is getting absolutely perverse, because it's not just that these people obviously amass so much money and power that it becomes really an incredible perversion and abnormality. But with that goes that you have right now an unbelievable process, which is very dangerous also, because it can lead to unpredictable consequences. You have an increasing mistrust of more and more parts of society, practically in the entire West, of being completely alienated by their government and losing all trust in the leading institutions. And since I jokingly mentioned already that the yellow vests could be recognized as the legitimate government in France, well, I mean, you saw the Brexit, you saw the vote of President Trump. You have a new Italian government rejecting these values, and now you have the yellow vest phenomena in France. But it is really leading to a condition where this famous Western model is being rejected by more and more people, because they recognize that this present establishment could not care less about the common good of the people. And I think this figure of 26 billionaires owning as much as half of the human population is really the giveaway of what's wrong with this system.
Now, to come back to something we were talking about earlier, the operations, the corrupt operations that are run outside of official channels, the so-called secret government, what we've identified as the British meddling in the United States. Tomorrow, January 27th, is a very important anniversary of something that happened that was done under the direction of George Herbert Walker Bush, who was being directed on this by the British. Why don't you say something about that, Helga, because it has a special personal meaning for you.
Yes, the 27th of January, 30 years ago, was the day where my husband and a whole number of his associates were put in jail. And, this is the biggest atrocity in the legal history of the United States. This is not only my view, but this was expressed publicly by Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General of the Johnson administration, who on his own came to the defense of my husband simply because he thought that this was the biggest case of injustice in the entire history of the United States, because it was not only aimed to destroy a political leader and his movement. Ramsey Clark said it was aimed to do both, but it was especially the effort to extinct a birthplace, a cradle of beautiful ideas and ideas, bringing solutions to the problems of the world. Now, I think the biggest crime was not just what was done to my husband and his colleagues. I mean, that was terrible, and the people who did that will have a place in history in hell. Maybe they are in hell in reality, or there will be, but in history they will be in hell for sure. But the biggest crime was that the American population was denied the access to those solutions. And I would absolutely make the point that the miserable condition in which the United States finds itself today, which is, the Russian minister referred to in Davos, related to the open society and the neoliberal model. But, if you look at the fact that the United States today is, I think, the only so-called advanced country where the longevity is going back, is going down. And if you have any parameter for an economic collapse of a country, then it is that the life expectancy of the people is being reduced. And this is now happening the second year in sequence. You have the drug epidemic. You have the increase of suicide rates. You have a general, really very dire situation, a collapsing infrastructure, which President Trump, despite his best intention, was not yet able to remedy because, simply of the Democrats and the neocons in his own party, he has been stifled, especially because of this operation by Mueller. But, as Barbara Boyd pointed out in a three-piece, extremely important series of articles about this whole complex, the apparatus which went after my husband and his colleagues in the 80s, the apparatus which covered up the Saudi role, in particular in cooperation with corrupt elements in the United States in the cover-up of 9/11, and the apparatus which is going after Trump today in the British coup, but in collusion with corrupt elements in the United States. These three incidents or these three processes were absolutely run by the same people. And what is at stake, is that must be remedied, justice must be brought. I have said many times that President Trump should basically do what he announced he would do, declassify all the documents relating to the British aspect, to the Christopher Steele dossier, and this whole coup against him. I think the call to reinvestigate the 4 assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, which was issued recently by 60 prominent Americans, including the children of Robert Kennedy. All of this is part and parcel of the colleagues. Dennis Small wrote a very beautiful statement calling for the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche at this 30 years anniversary. And I would appeal to all of you who are watching this program, please sign this and help us to make an international campaign, because it puts at the same time the limelight on that apparatus, which is the problem today. And if that apparatus is successful, the confrontation with Russia and China is immediately on the table. So please sign this appeal for the exoneration of my husband and his associates. I think this is the most important you can do for the future of humanity, for peace, and for the honor of my husband.
Well, with that, Helga, I think we should go ahead till next week, and there'll be a lot happening, but you can find that statement. It should be on the Schiller Institute website, LaRouche PAC website. Helga, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, till next week.